Hi, welcome to Beyond Authentic Witchcraft, the magical meandering podcast. Other way around, but you get what I'm saying. I'm Lisa, and I'm joined as ever by the ever so wonderful Neil.
Hello.
And coming up, we are actually going to be joined by a guest, but we're going to tell you more about that in just a second. Before we do, we've got a new segment that we want to cover because there's lots and lots of really interesting witchcraft news all around the world. Now, this isn't just from Witch Talk, okay?
Good.
Although I am going to bring in some Witch Talk videos at some point, Neil. I am going to subject you to the wonders of Witch Talk. But we've actually found a couple of really interesting news stories. So we've picked out one that we want to cover for this episode. So this is actually from the BBC News website. I need to put my old lady specs on for this. So this is genuine, official, actual news. Now, you found this, Neil, and when you sent it to me, I was like, is that real? But it is. This is actually genuine. So this is from a couple of days back, as we're filming this now. And it says, a degree in magic is being offered in 2024, will be one of the first in the UK, the University of Exeter has said. The innovative, questionable, MA in Magic and Occult Science has been created following a recent surge in the interest in magic, the course leader said. It would be offering an opportunity to study the history and impact of witchcraft and magic around the world on society and science, bosses said. The one-year program starts in September 2024. Academics with expertise in history, literature, philosophy, archaeology, sociology, psychology, drama, and religion, basically in everything, right? Academics in everything, apart from maybe sewing, will show the role of magic on the West and the East. That sounds really interesting. The university said it was one of the only postgraduate courses of its kind in the UK to combine the study of the history of magic with such a wide range of other subjects. Professor Emily Selove, love that name, course leader said, a recent surge in interest in magic and the occult inside and outside of academia lies at the heart of the most urgent questions of our society. Decolonization, the exploration of alternative epistemologies, feminism and anti-racism are at the core of this program. The course will be offered in the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. You see, that I find really interesting. Professor Nasilov said this MA will allow people to re-examine the assumption that the West is the place of rationalism and science, while the rest of the world is a place of magic and superstition. The university said the course would prepare students for careers in teaching, counselling, mentoring, heritage and museum work in libraries, tourism, art organizations, or the publishing industry, among other areas of work. Interesting, there's no preparation for witchcraft in amongst all of that. It says a choice of modules includes dragons in Western literature and art. Okay. And the legend of King Arthur, paleography, Islamic thought, archaeological theory and practice, and the depiction of women in the Middle Ages. I'm not quite sure what I make of that. It's on the surface, it sounds like it's going to be a really interesting degree course. So it sounds like there's going to be lots and lots and lots of theosophical study, lots of really intense kind of, let's look at it from a sociological, a historical practice. But then I don't know. It just feels like a really weird mix for a syllabus. What do you think?
I don't know. I'm really into the idea because in general, I like learning about stuff to do with witchcraft in history, how it factors into just anthropology, sociology in general. I like kind of unpicking different practices from that angle. So something like that, I think I would find very interesting. But I think it must be very generalized because there's only obviously so much they can pack in there. So, I mean, it'd be very interesting actually finding someone who's doing that course and asking them all about it and what it entails.
Maybe what we need to do is revisit this in 2025 when somebody's done the 1 year course and we can go, what was it? Tell us about it. Like, send us all the stuff that you got sent to study. I find it really interesting that it's within the, hang on, what did it say? It's within the Institute of Islamic, Arabic and Islamic Studies. The Institute of Arabic and Islamic Studies, yeah. That sounds like it's it's such a wide area, and it's only a 1-year course.
Mm,
I kind of struggle as to how they're going to get all of those bits in together. Especially because that sounds very like it's very Eastern philosophy, but then there's so much of the Western philosophy that we're still discovering and that we're still looking at, such as things like Druidry,
mm.
which brings us very. Did you see that link there? Look at that. It was so
Great
smooth, nobody would
segue.
notice it. But that is an interesting segue into our guest on today's podcast. So we're going to ask their opinion. So first of all, please welcome to the podcast, Holland.
Hi.
So Holland, hi, welcome officially to the podcast. First of all, before we go into why you're here and everything else, Holland uses they them pronouns, so we've got that bit out of the way. And you have the interest in Druidry. So what would your take be on that degree course? Is that something that would interest you?
I don't think that I would personally study it. I do think it's really interesting. It's certainly not the first online course, in paganism or magic or whatever you want to call it, but it's the first one at what you might call a proper university. So it's really interesting. And like you, I think it's a strange mix of stuff. But I'm excited to see that it's got the aspect of feminism and anti-racism stuff in there. So I think that would be a really interesting mix of stuff to study.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think it's something that I like the idea of kind of where it's going and what they've come up with. I just question it. It feels really ambitious for a 1-year course. That's my only concern. But anyway, that was the news. I know, right? That was a good segment on the news. Yes. And let us know in the comment section if that's something that you would be interested in doing, actually. I did think, Neil, when you sent the course, I did think, oh, it's going to be like a Hogwarts thing. No, it wasn't. It's far more academic. So that counts me out, as the Dragon's Den would say. Anyway, welcome to the podcast, Holland. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how maybe we met, how we know each other?
Hi, I'm Holland. I'm here because Lisa asked me to be. And I met Lisa, how many years ago was it now?
More than I remember.
It was a good few. Certainly, it was before the pandemic, so that puts it at probably 2019. I think it was 2019.
Something like that. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and we met at a trans and non-binary support group, which Lisa was helping, or kind of not really helping to run, but running, essentially. Yeah, and I just immediately found her a really interesting person, as well as well as Rufus as well. And I didn't know at that point that she was a pagan. Maybe you were a little bit reluctant to tell me because I was involved in the church, and most people would think that a church would not be compatible with paganism, but it's not that kind of church. It's very
it was a Unitarian church, which is why it was welcoming to not just the trans non-binary communities, but also to everybody of any walk of life. So it was a really lovely space. So yeah.
So Lisa said at the beginning of the podcast that we have a druid on the show today. So is that how you would describe yourself, Holland?
That's not an easy question to answer. It's a yes and no.
Okay.
This is going to sound like I'm going completely off topic, but it's relevant, I promise. So I used to work in libraries, and when I did, everyone who in my life, family and friends who didn't work in libraries, would call me a librarian, and I'd be just like, yeah, all right, yeah, call me that. That's fine. I'm a librarian, whatever. But I wasn't a librarian, because librarians are like up here. It's like in the hierarchy, they're pretty high up, whereas I was the lowest level of library assistant. So if I was talking to people who worked in libraries, I would say I'm a library assistant, but to anyone else, I was a librarian. And it's like that with Druidry. So the path is Druidry. I'm technically not a druid, because that's like the highest level. It's not necessarily a hierarchy as such, but when you study it, there are 3 phases to it. They're all equally important, but the first one is bard, the second one is ovate, and the third one is druid. So I'm not at that furthest level. I'm at the first level, so I'm a bard.
So for anyone anyone out there who doesn't really know what a druid is, could you kind of describe the typical beliefs and values and practice? What is a druid typically?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because most people, I think, when they hear those terms, they're going to be thinking of stuff like computer games or Dungeons and Dragons or whatever. And it does use some of the same terms. But yeah, there's the bards are like when you're studying it, that's the first level, and it's all about creativity. So if you've heard about if you've heard the term in terms of like wandering minstrels, people going around and singing for their supper, it's exactly that. So historically, the bards were people who went around telling stories and reciting poetry and singing. And what they were doing wasn't just entertainment, they were also spreading stories of deities and myths and legends, and it would come along with like fables, where it comes along with the moral of the story kind of thing. So that was the first level of Druidry. So if you think of Druidry as like an organization, the bards would be like the communications department.
Okay.
They would be the ones that would be spreading the word. The second level would be the ovates, and they're a little bit like Lisa because they're all about divination and also about healing. And then the third level is kind of like almost the priests of Druidry, so they're like mystics and teachers and stuff. There's also talk of shape-shifting. I don't think I believe that, but some people may, and that's fine. So that's what the three different types are like. In terms of what Druidry is as a path, it's really essentially it's Celtic paganism. So specific to the Celtic areas, which at one point was all of Britain plus other areas. And then as the Romans were invading and they were bringing in Christianity, it got kind of pushed back to the areas that we now think of as Celtic, which is like Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, a few other parts of Europe and stuff, because they were the areas that held on to their beliefs the longest. So there's a particular pantheon of deities, which are the Celtic ones. So you've probably heard of some of them from the Wheel of the Year. So you've got Lugh from Lunasa. There's Imbolc, which celebrates Brigid. And there's one more. It slipped my mind. From Beltane. Yeah, there's Bel.
Okay.
4 of the festivals that you may know of from the Wiccan or pagan Wheel of the Year are actually Celtic, and the other 4 are from elsewhere. So it's specifically Celtic. In terms of what Druidry does that paganism or Celtic paganism sometimes does and sometimes doesn't, there's like 3 essential areas that I would pick out. One is nature worship. So obviously you're going to find that in all paganism, or nature reverence, however you want to describe it. The second thing I would say is reverence for ancestors. And this is not just at Samhain, this is all year long. It's a huge part of Druidry, is that, throughout your life, whatever you're doing, it's like your ancestors are with you and you're thinking about them in your practice and in your everyday life. So that is a big part of it. And then the third thing is Arwen. It's called that's a term you probably haven't heard, but it's Arwen. It means creativity, but not just creativity, but like creativity and spirituality intertwined. So and Arwen itself is a Welsh word, and it's like flow of inspiration, potentially from a divine source. Arwen is something that is particularly specific to the bard level, because once you get onto Ovate and Druid, you're focusing on other things. So yeah, in terms of practice, some druids do get together like covens, but they call them groves, like trees. I've always found that quite a funny term. I'm not in a grove. I think I would quite like to be, but I just don't have druid friends. In fact, I don't have very many pagan friends. But there's also a lot of solitary practitioners. Probably most druids would be solitary. And for me, that daily practice would be stuff like meditation and prayer, the occasional bit of folk magic, because I can't remember anything too complicated. But that's not specifically a druid thing. That's just a Holland thing.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. You're preaching to
Me
the
thing as
choir
well.
here.
Yeah.
So that's what it's all about.
So obviously we met via the Unitarian Church. So were you like, how did your spiritual kind of path lead you to Druidry? Because that isn't something that I would associate necessarily with Unitarians, but maybe it is. I mean, like we've obviously, me and Neil have talked on previous podcasts about our weird and wonderful kind of twists and turns that led us to where we are. So what was your sort of twisty turny path to this wonderful world?
It's been a long road, I would say that. Unitarians are really open-minded, particularly about spiritual beliefs. So basically, you can believe whatever you want if you're a Unitarian, so it's absolutely fine to be a Unitarian and something else as well. I would say most Unitarians are Christians or humanists, but some are pagans. There's probably not that many Unitarian druids, but, you know, it certainly is compatible. I would say that much. But it's been a long road, because as a kid, even just like at the age of 7 or something, I was interested in spirituality in general. And I remember asking my mum if God existed. I'll try not to use the G word again, but yeah, I remember asking her, just because I know it can be a little bit of a trigger for some people. I remember asking her that, and I think she gave me a really good answer, which was, you have to figure that out for yourself. So my way of doing that was to go to a church, which maybe wasn't the best idea, because, you know, not all churches are the same. And I just thought they were all the same, you know. I just thought a church is a church is a church. But unfortunately, some of them are really not good places, especially for children. And it wasn't. It really, really wasn't. We're talking very, very bigoted views. They would stand up at the front of the pulpit and say things like, we should bring back the death penalty in this country. And another thing that they said was that gay people are not allowed in this church. They deserve to. So
nice.
Yeah, and I'd like to say that was the moment that I left, but I was 12 years old, and I wasn't strong enough yet. It took me a few years, but I did leave at the age of 15, after hearing more of that kind of thing. But I was still spiritual, and I wanted to still express that. And I would say that I really only knew of 2 types of spirituality, and one was Christianity, and the other, which I'd heard of from things like Buffy and Charmed, was paganism. So yeah, I am of that generation where I did come from Buffy and Charmed. Obviously, I didn't think that I could float pencils or close doors with my mind or anything like that. Luckily, what I did have on my side was that my home was kind of quite technologically advanced, because my stepdad works in IT. So he would bring home all these little parts of computers and like Frankenstein them together. And so we would all have our own desktop computer in an age where most people would just have one for the household. So I had my own. We had Wi-Fi in an age when everyone else had dial-up. So yeah, things like, we didn't even have Google search yet, but in an age, we didn't even have Google search yet, but we had Yahoo search and we had AOL. So that was my window into finding more about paganism, and chat rooms as well, which were a big thing back then. That you don't really see them anymore.
No, chat rooms were massive. I was in quite a few sort of well, not early, because it was just all there was at the time, but quite a few chat rooms back in the day for paganism. It's really interesting that you talk about Buffy and Charmed, because me, Neil, and Lorna, who was on a recent podcast, we've been talking about it in a private WhatsApp group where we've just been nattering. And I was saying that Buffy was actually really good for witchcraft. Charmed wasn't, because Charmed was just, we're going to make this potion bottle and chuck it at a demon and all that. But Buffy, the way that it started to show witchcraft and magic was actually, okay, it was Hollywoodized, but there was a lot of very genuine stuff in there as it went along, until it went completely off the rails and everything became, you know, Hollywood movie effects. But in the early days, there was a lot of really good, genuine, the progression from Willow from early days, sort of very, very light, fluffy Wiccan, and her path was a fascinating thing to look at, especially going back to it. Now, you said there about like the druid path. So what do you practice? What's your sort of typical values, belief? How is it part of your everyday life?
I would say it's quite simple stuff. So it's meditation and prayer, a little bit of folk magic, but probably the biggest thing I would say is the creativity thing, the concept of Arwen. For me anyway, and I would say that it probably is for most druids. Most druids stay at the bard level, which is all about the creativity aspect, because it probably just because it's the most interesting level. And the idea is that the very act of creating something, whether that's a poem or a song or a painting, whatever it might be, that creative act is in itself a spiritual act. And when I talk about this to people, or sometimes when I think about it, I think of that bit in Father Ted where where Dougal and Father Ted are talking, and Father Ted is telling him that he can praise God just by going to sleep, or by being quiet. And I often think about that, and I think, am I being Dougal by thinking that I can do this, you know, spiritual practice just by doing something creative? But you know what? Dougal was happy. He was a happy guy, you know, and you know, he was excited and grateful for the little things in his life, like a teacup. So even if I am being Dougal, I don't care. You know, I see creativity as a spiritual practice in and of itself. It doesn't necessarily have to be mixed with a, you know, magic or anything like that. I think it's a spiritual thing to me that comes from the divine, not necessarily like, oh, you know, the divine is speaking through me or anything, but just that the little spark of creativity comes from that place.
Yeah, because when you've mentioned it to me before, it's something that resonated with me, because for me, as a chaos magician, and I've got all my strange, funky ways of gnosis, and for me, creating things is a form of gnosis, and it is a form of magic. And sometimes it is just like how you said, like it's where it comes from. It's kind of, it does feel like a very spiritual thing at times. But for me, I do tend to create things and use that as a way of charging and launching. And, you know, I do things like, because I know that you play music and I play music as well. And when I'm playing the piano, I go into a very, very strange state where I feel in tune with something I don't necessarily know. And so, yeah, I totally get that with the creativity. I totally do. So tell us about Blue Chalice, which is an Etsy shop that you run. What do you create for that?
I create quite a few different things. Like you, Lisa, I have ADHD. And that definitely comes into it, because I can't stick with any one particular craft. So I make quite a few different things. I make witch bells, so that's like woven ribbons and things like that, and you weave bells into them and charms and things like that. I make a lot of things out of clay. I really, really like working with clay, so I make altar tiles and like little goddess figurines and things like that. Sometimes I'll do like printables, like a bit of art that you can download and print at home. And there's quite a few other things as well. I do a jewelry, earrings and bracelets and stuff like that. But yeah, whatever I happen to be interested in terms of crafts, that's what I bring in, you know, on that one day. And yes, that is one. I don't do those anymore. But that is like a plaster of Paris thing. Yeah.
Naming.
Just showing off some of your wares.
I just basically send Lisa whatever I can't sell.
And it normally ends up in my backgrounds as like hugely important pieces for me. So yes, I
So
love
how
it.
did you?
I love the
Yeah.
creativity that you have.
What made you think, oh, this is something that I'd like to make and sell? And how did
Well,
you?
that happened pretty much at the same time as I got into Druidry, or very soon
Okay.
after. Because what happened was that my granddad died, and we were very close. He was Scottish, and as many people do when they have a loss like that, I started looking into my ancestry, which is Celtic, Scottish, through him. And that's very common, that people will look into their family tree when somebody dies, and they're kind of thinking, I should have asked them more questions and stuff like that. And then as I learned more and more about my ancestry, I wanted to start exploring how that connected with paganism, because it was an interest that I'd had sort of on the back burner for quite a long time. But like I said, I got into it when I was a teenager, and then it was an interest that I had for a few years, and then kind of dropped off a bit. It was on the back burner. And I think, honestly, it was Lisa that kind of brought it to the fore a little bit with me, because Lisa, although I've met pagans before Lisa is the first person I've ever met who is a pagan that I would consider a friend. And seeing her talk about it more on her channel, it kind of made me interested in it again. But my own personal path was not just paganism in general, but Celtic, because of this, this interest that I had. So that led to Druidry, because Druidry is based on Celtic paganism. It is one specific path that is based on it, but of course we've also got Wicca, and Wicca is heavily Celtic as well. I just happened to go down the path of Druidry, and found that it kind of really fit, probably partly because of the Celtic thing and partly because of the creativity thing. It just kind of all fit together. So yeah, it resonates for me.
So when did you start thinking, oh, well, these things that I make that are related to the Druidry, creating things, when did you decide, well, maybe I'll start selling some of these? Like, what kind of made you think of doing that?
What happened was, I wasn't actually already making them. What happened was, I was looking for things for my Druid altar, and I was looking on Etsy and thinking, I could make that. I could make that. I could make that, because I've always been interested in crafts. So I did. And it was a really good, in the beginning, it was a really good distraction from the grief.
Yeah.
But it turned into something more than that. It turned into a business, but not just a business, but a practice that, like I say, is kind of spiritual in and of itself. So it's something that I do mindfully, and thinking about the purpose of each item as well. And I probably spend a little bit longer making each thing than I should, because I don't earn enough as a result. But I kind of can't do anything else, really. I feel like I have to put my all into each piece. And I think that when you look at the reviews for the shop, you can see that people can tell that. So it's nice to see.
That's nice. Do you see yourself progressing to the next level? And is that kind of under a certain like order or society, or?
Yeah, you don't have to.
Sorry, is it the OBO? Is that isn't there a couple of different sort of organizations? My knowledge is very limited, but also Neil will tell you I am horrendously bad at 3-letter acronyms, so I forget them all the time. But I'm sure there's like the OBO or something. Is that right?
You're absolutely right. What you're thinking of is OBOD, OBOD. There's 4 letters. Whereas the one I follow is the BDO, which is 3 letters. And OBOD is the one that is more well known, because it's I think it's based in America. So that's the one everyone thinks of. Whereas the one I follow is the British Druidry Order. No, sorry,
Okay.
the British Druid Order. I'm getting confused because the website is druidry.co.uk. But yes, you don't have to follow one of these things to be a druid or to follow the druid path. And I kind of wish that I'd known that in the beginning, because it costs a lot. It costs a lot to do courses.
Yeah.
What they are is courses.
Okay.
And the reason I went with British Druid Order was because they're a bit cheaper than the other one, and they were British. So yeah, you can actually learn this stuff without following a formal program. But I did. I went on the Bard course with the British Druid Order. I haven't actually finished it. It's one of these things. It's like I've been chipping away at it in the background for a long time, and that's okay. You can take as long as you want with it. I don't see myself going on to one of the other levels, like the Ovate or the Druid, simply because my interest is in this creative Arwen thing. I think that's always where my heart's going to be.
Yeah.
So it feels a little bit pointless to do these other steps when I know that I'm never going to be that into it. So
Well, yeah, that's it. It's kind of like, if that's where that resonates for you, then you may as well stay there. It's like there's no need to progress. It's like me when I was in the IoT, like, so what? You'd get to learn about this and at these other levels, and it's like, well, no, I'm quite happy where I am and doing things how I want to do them and things like that. You know, it's at the kind of level or where you are now. Would you say there are certain parts of Druidry that you're not so much into, or is there things that you are into doing that doesn't really mesh with that pathwise? Like, what other interests do you have kind of in that witchcrafty area?
I would say that I'm not as interested in the aspects that you start getting into when you're an ovate. So you get into divination and healing. I'm not saying I'm uninterested entirely, because I have oracle cards and tarot decks and things like that. I have also studied sound healing. So I do have an interest in it, but I just not enough of an interest to continue on to the ovate part of things. I'd also say that I'm not entirely, my belief system is a little bit different than a lot of druids. Typically they are animists, which means that they believe that there is like a spirit in everything, like every tree, every stone, maybe even a building. And I find that a really interesting idea, but I'm not an animist. What I am is a pantheist. And when I mentioned this to Lisa, you were talking about like pantheons, but it's not to do with pantheons necessarily. It's so
It's all right. I literally got confused between pantheist and polytheist. So my brain went, but again, the ADHD connection connected it to the wrong part. And so my brain was going, blah, 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 and it's like, nope, it's not that. It's the other thing, the other connection. So yeah.
Yeah, so just to explain those things. So a polytheist is someone who believes in lots of different deities, gods and goddesses. And a pantheist is someone like me, is someone who believes, I believe in a deity, just one, but one that is everywhere and in everything and in everyone. So to my mind, there is a little spark of the divine in every person and every creature and every stone and every tree, blah, 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 blah. And I see that as very compatible with polytheism and with animism. To me, they're just different ways of saying the same thing. They're just like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
It's just that to me, it's all part of one. So if we're talking about specific deity names or the spirits of a certain place, it's aspects of that greater something. Whereas somebody else, a polytheist, might believe that they're entirely separate entities. But to me, that it's compatible. It's essentially the same thing.
See, my immediate brain goes to, of all places, Babylon 5, which I bizarrely go to for quite a lot of spiritual connections. But there is a couple of quotes in there. One is that there is a whole race that follow what would probably be considered sort of space druidism, if you like. But they have that belief that the universe, we are all star stuff, we are all the universe made manifest. And one of the other races has this line about literally like, look at the shadow, look at the light on the wall. We understand that that light is being cast from something, but what would an ant understand about the light on the wall? And there's lots of connectivity, but I do firmly believe that. Say again, sorry.
You're talking about Plato's forms there, essentially.
Wow. Yeah. But it also goes into this sort of element of this fact that we are the universe trying to make sense of itself, which I adore, because again, that is the very pantheist kind of theology. I'm mixing up theology and philosophy. It is the pantheist philosophy, if you like, that every little spark of life is interconnected with every other spark of life, and I adore that. I absolutely I don't put it into any religious context, but for me that is that's the answer. Like, you're looking for the answer to life, the universe, and everything. We are life, the universe, and everything. That is the answer.
I think that there is a reason why everyone says that when they're either drunk or high. We're all connected. I just think that knowledge is there in all of us. Sometimes it requires a different state of mind to see it.
Obviously, I've never been drunk or high. Neil, shut up.
Oh, no,
yeah. No comment, Neil. We've known each other too many years, so no comment on that. Just while I've got these two lovely people on the podcast, I think this is a really good time to mention that, as you've seen by just the little thing under their names, both of them run Etsy shops, and they're very, very good. So I totally recommend you to check out their Etsy shops. Now, they didn't know I was going to do this, and equally, you would have seen this as part of my videos, on a lot of my videos, and a lot of my live streams. And I am not paid for this. They don't give me any kickback whatsoever. I just thoroughly recommend both of their businesses.
Are you a fan of 80s horror but want something different? Do you like modern horror but the regular magazines leave you a bit cold? Are you a fan of that schlocky horror that no one else seems to talk about? Check out Necronomicon, the UK horror zine from Etsy.com. Just search for Necro Neil.
Blue Chalice is a small business making crafty creations for the Witcher community. From jewellery to wall hangings, witch bells to altar tiles. Why not have a look at bluechalice.etsy.com. So yes, check those out, because I can 100% recommend them, genuinely, authentically. But in that little clip there, Holland, there was quite a few of the items that you've made previously. Now, I know that some of those may or may not be available currently on Etsy, but that gives people an idea of the sort of things that, especially the witch bells that were in there. I love those. I've got a set from you hanging on my front door, so every time the door opens, it tinkles a really nice little sort of sound, which is a protective element, but it's also a really nice way of knowing if the dogs are running in and out. So it's practical as well as magical. I love it. So then, before we started this podcast, I would probably say that my knowledge of Druidry was extremely limited. So I'd met Uther Pendragon, who I believe was Obod person, I believe, for the UK. He claims descendants from King Arthur, and I'd met him several times at Stonehenge at various solstice events and things, and he's a lovely guy, but very much what you expect from a druid: the robes, the hair, the staff, all of that, very much sort of a magical wizardy type bloke. And then the only other sort of real reference I had to Druidry was from The Undertaker from WWE, which used to come to the ring. I mean, this is where the dong comes from. That bell is part of his walk to the stage. and he would have these cloaked figures that would then, especially at one point during the 90s, he had these signs that would light up in flames and all sorts of like weird and wonderful, like spooky stuff. And obviously with Neil being into the horror side of things, there's plenty of horror videos and films from the 80s and 90s and 70s that depicted druids in the same sort of way, with the cloaks and the robes and this sort of quite malevolency about it. But from what you're saying, druidry is the exact opposite of that.
Yeah, I don't think that image does druidry that much harm, because it's showing it as like a mystery to be explored.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it makes it more interesting. And certainly there's parts of mysticism that are in it, but in the higher levels of druidry.
Yeah, I mean, basically, that's kind of where my idea of druidry comes from, is kind of old horror films, you know, where it's kind of a bit of a mystical dark order, and kind of my own, you know, dabblings in different types of paths. I have never really gone down into druidry too much. I didn't really know too much until Holland came on. I mean, the only thing I really knew about druidry is that there wasn't much kind of recorded about the druids, and it's kind of, wasn't it sort of, the idea of modern druidry kind of came about in the, was it about 70s or something, and they kind of came up with a general idea of what it would have been about.
Yeah, this is a big problem with druidry. I think a lot of the preconceptions and things that you see in the films are based on Freemasonry.
Yeah.
And and there is quite a lot of that it does come into druidry to some extent. And the reason that happens is because druids weren't supposed to write anything down, historically. So the ancient druids, they were forbidden to write anything down, which meant it was completely an oral tradition that was passed on through the bards.
Oh, that makes sense. The idea of the wandering bard.
Yeah. So they were supposed to memorize everything, right? And this was a monumental task for them. I don't know how they did it. Maybe that's just because I have ADHD and I can't remember, you know, even like a couple of sentences. How they memorized all that stuff and went around doing it all from memory, I don't know. There must have been, you know, it must have changed. Yeah, I think with any oral tradition, it changes over time and people adapt things. You know, they'll say, oh, this story happened nearby in Mexico or wherever it might be. Whereas, it, you know, somebody from somewhere else will say, oh, it happened here instead. Lots of little changes here and there. But yeah, this is the problem, is that it was an oral tradition. It wasn't supposed to be written down. And it wasn't until it was dying out that they started writing it down. So what happened was the Romans came in with Christianity. And normally the Romans, wherever they went, wherever they invaded, they would be like, it wasn't as bad as some invasions are. They would try to do it peacefully. They would say, okay, here are our gods. What are your gods, your goddesses? Tell us about your deities. And what we'll do is we'll worship your deities and ours. We'll all worship all of the deities. The problem came when they adopted Christianity, because that was a monotheistic religion. So what they did instead, when they came to Britain and they found all these deities, was they were like, or change them into saints and things like that, and biblical characters. It was really the Romans that shaped Christianity. Like, it did exist before they came along, but it was a cult. It was like a little known thing.
The cult
and
of Jesus Christ, wasn't it?
Yeah, they took it and they adapted it for their own political purposes, because they wanted to bring the Jews on board. So the only way of kind of doing that softly approach was to kind of say, oh, this goddess, for instance, Brigitte, is now a saint, a Christian saint, things like that. So they would merge it as best they could, but it was very difficult to do so. And what happened was, by the time they started writing down druidry, it was meshed so hard with Christianity that you couldn't tell which was which. Like you can kind of look at it and try and figure it out, but the problem is that you're not looking at it through an ancient lens anymore. You're not seeing the historical context. You're just seeing it through the modern context. So we can't really figure out what's what. And there also isn't much to go on because they only did it really in Wales. They wrote down 4 books in Wales. So most of what we have in Druidry is Welsh. And they just really wrote down the poems that the bards went round reciting, which did have a lot of stuff in it, but you needed that historical context to know what it was all about. So looking at it now, you're like, okay, but these are nice poems, but what does it mean? And we don't know, and we have to try and extrapolate that and figure that out, and we just can't do it from a modern lens. So we do have some stuff to go on, but it's not much. Most of modern Druid practice is probably nothing like Druidry in ancient terms, and we know that, and we accept that, and we just say, okay, we're going to call it that. We're going to try to base it as much as we can on the Celtic pagan beliefs, but you know, it essentially really has the same root as Wicca. So all that Wicca stuff that came about in the 70s, it's the same root.
So it's a bit like the Iliad, where it's the only record we've kind of got, but it isn't complete and it isn't in its historical context, and therefore we all interpret it differently because we're seeing it through modern lenses every time we look at it. So it sounds very similar to that. I didn't know that there was like even that amount of written history. That's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that they wrote bits down in other countries as well. There was a bit in Scotland and stuff, but unfortunately the languages have died out more there. So what we have, we don't always know how to read. And of course they would have had slightly different beliefs and practices in, you know, whether it was Ireland or Scotland or Cornwall. So yeah, it is really hard to reconstruct these things.
I can't be the only one who's watching this or listening to this and thinking, hang on, how do I not know anything about Druidry? And yet we have this sort of stereotypical idea of what the Druids were. So if somebody else is watching or listening to this and they're like, hang on a second, do you mean Druids are actually a real thing? How does somebody go about investigating this a bit more? I know you spoke about the BDO. I got that right. You spoke about the BDO earlier. So like, what are the avenues for people to discover sort of modern Druidry? How would you recommend somebody does that?
I think the BDO is a good one to start with if you're British. As I say, there is a cost involved, and it is like doing a course. So that's one option, and that is you can find that at druidry.co.uk. There's also the OBOD, that's the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, and that is, I think that one's based in America. I'm not sure of the website, but if you Google OBOD, it will come up. But you don't have to go down that road of studying it formally, because you can find out a lot just from books. And I would recommend, in particular, there's one author called Joanna van der Hoven. And I started with a book called The Arwen Alone, by her, and I think that's a good one to start with. It's just quite a short book, but it's a good introduction to the subject. And I would also say, in terms of other authors, from the British Druid order, there's Philip Shallcrass, who calls himself Grey Wolf as his craft name, and there's also Emma Restall Orr. So any books written by either of those would be really interesting, and they would be sort of on the British side of things. And there's also Philip Carr Gom, who has some involvement very high up with the OBOD. I'm not sure what his title is, but he's involved heavily in the OBOD, and he's written quite a lot of books as well. So yeah, there's Joanna van der Hoven, Philip Shallcrass, Emma Restall Orr, and Philip Carr Gom. Lots of books there to look at. And just, Google is your friend. There's lots of information to be found. And yeah, it is usually cheaper to buy these things on Kindle. If you're buying them new, sometimes you can get them second hand for cheaper as a physical copy as well.
Oh, thank you for coming on, Holland. It's just been so fascinating. I love these episodes where people come on as guests and tell us all about their path. So is there anything else you'd like to plug? Your Etsy again? Anything else you would like to direct people towards?
Where can people find your Arwen? Hopefully I've said that the right way. Is that right? Can you use it like that?
That's right. Yes. Yes.
Yay! I've got something right.
Learning.
So where can we get your Arwen then?
My Arwen. Yeah. Okay. So I have a Bandcamp page, which is where I keep all my music. That's probably my biggest form of Arwen is my music. Spend a lot of time writing and composing and recording music that no one ever listens to. So if you do want to listen to it, you can find it at holmorel.bandcamp.com. And if you want to look at my Etsy shop, which I mentioned earlier, I make things like witch bells and auto tiles. You can find that at bluechalice.etsy.com.
That's fantastic.
Excellent.
And I'll make sure that we put the links to that down in the description box. So do please check that out. I feel like I've had my eyes open, my brain opened, and I feel like I barely touched the surface, and there's a whole new area of magical practice and sort of study that I now want to kind of delve into a little bit. So yeah, expect a few text messages to come, Holland, going, when you said this, what did you mean by that? How do I do that? So yeah, expect that in the weeks and months to come. But anyway, as Neil said, thank you ever so much for coming on the podcast. This has been fascinating. It really has. And hopefully everybody that's watched or listened to this will agree that it's just, I didn't know any of this. Absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
No worries. But that is going to be it from us here on the podcast. So don't forget, give us the YouTube thumbs uppy things, all of the social media things, wherever you access your podcast. So if you're getting this on one of the audio only streams, do the like, follow, heart, whatever, all of the things, do the things. You know, I don't know anything about social media properly. So do the things that show that you like it, and hopefully that will help other people find the podcast. But that is it from us. And as I always say, stay you, stay true, stay authentic, and keep practicing.
Keep experimenting.
And follow the Arwen.
And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.